Hey there, friends and fellow nature journalers. I am really excited to share some ideas about how to use your composition and layout in your nature journals, especially in the field. And I'm going to start off talking about why composition and layout are important. And then I'm going to give specific tips that you can use in your journals. And then I'm going to give some different tools that I like to use, including some of the pens and pencils that I think are especially helpful when doing nature journaling composition. And what I'm actually going to start off with, though, is let me get my journals out. I actually have my journals packed into these bins now because I'm not on evacuation warning yet, but I'm pretty close to the Wallbridge fire and it's really smoky. So I just have all of my nature journals packed away in these bins because they're actually, my old nature journals are one of my most prized possessions. So I'm actually pulling them out of this bin right now, and I have bookmarked some of the pages that I think will be useful to look at when talking about composition. All right, let me put this huge bin away. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about why composition is important. I think it's easy to focus on a lot of other things in nature journaling, but it's useful to talk about composition, and I'm going to show you why. I have a couple examples. I have a bunch of different journals that I've picked out, and I have a couple examples of things not to do, and then some things that you can do. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why composition is so important. So the first reason is aesthetics. And I know that on Friday, I did a whole live stream about how important it is for us to share our pages that don't look as aesthetically pleasing or don't fit certain standards. But so this might seem slightly contradictory in some ways, but most people do actually at some level want their pages to look good. And that's a whole philosophical discussion. I'm not going to get into too much here, sort of like defining what looks good, what is aesthetically pleasing. That's like a big branch of philosophy, actually. And so I'm not going to get into that. But what I also want to mention is that in addition to the composition affecting the way your page looks, it can actually make your page look good to you and to other people, even without your drawings actually changing. And so one thing that I find can happen and can be frustrating for people is they might not know why a page doesn't look the way they want it to. And one of those things can be composition. So there's certain aspects of balance and ratios that are really important. I'm not going to get super technical about it, but then the other thing in addition to aesthetics is readability. And these two kind of go hand in hand. So there's something about what we find visually pleasing is often something that is easier to understand. So some pages in a nature journal could be really busy, and they might not be organized in a way that allows for readability. And that readability is important for you, the creator of the page, but it's also important if you want to share that page. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the major things there, but first let me show you a page that I think exemplifies the importance of composition. So this is from, this is from some years ago. Let's see here. It's from 2016, and I was nature journaling at the Academy of Sciences. And I think this page has a lot of good stuff going for it. You know, there was some really cool fish that I was drawing. But what I want to point out is that this page has a sort of busyness that I think makes it harder to read. And we're going to analyze some of that right now. And so one of the things that's really important for layout in your nature journals is having a consistent visual vocabulary. Now, if you're taking notes, that's something definitely worth writing down. A consistent visual vocabulary. And what you'll notice here is I'm kind of flip-flopping between where I'm using pen, like this ink brush, and where I'm using pencil, where I'm using these arrows that are colored in, and in other places I'm using text that is outlined in pencil, but otherwise mostly made up of color. So including the title up here. And I'm also inconsistent with these boxes. So you'll notice here, This is my metadata up here, Nature Journal Club, California Academy of Sciences, and you see this very bold black ink around the metadata. And then here it's black ink around basically a small note about how this fish is moving. And then down here, it's so there's not really consistency. Most of the drawings are kind of faintly outlined in pencil, relying pretty heavily on the watercolor. And then this ink stands out so much, I think it can be distracting. So this page, I know a bunch of you are gonna say like, oh, don't be so hard on yourself, you know, that page has some good stuff going. But I just wanna point out that I believe this page has a good degree of busyness, and it's inconsistent in its visual vocabulary. Now, let me give you another example. This is an example where I think also the composition is not ideal, and it has a little bit more to do with balance. So I mentioned consistent visual vocabulary. Balance is also important. So this page here has, you'll notice that there's this really strong, my title up here, I think, actually this isn't even a title, this is sort of just a note to myself, but is in this really bold ink. And it's so close to the top that it's kind of looks like it's falling off the page. And that makes your eyes kind of go off the top of the page in a way that is not ideal. Then at the bottom, these landscape ethos are really fun, and I have these, you know, these swatches down here, but it's sort of awkward the way that they're so close to the middle here, and there's this large amount of space here, and then there's nothing up here that really balances that out. So this page is an example of not the ideal balance, and this one has the lack of a consistent visual vocabulary as well as busyness. Now let me show you another example where the balance is kind of messed up. Well, here, this one, you can see here, this is just busy, I would say. These are nicely framed, and we'll talk more about frames and how frames and outlines can be really useful. But notice how these two landscape ethos are framed there. And then these two here are also framed, but then I decided I'm just gonna draw these rocks right here, and I kind of just kept going off the page with the rocks, and then I did this whole experimental thing here, but overall the page ends up looking kind of weird. Now, so let me reiterate again, you know, on Friday I was talking so much about how we should share pages that don't meet the visual standards, the unspoken visual standards, and how important that is on the Nature Journal Club Facebook page especially. But I want to point out that sometimes it's totally fine to do experimental stuff and not worry about the aesthetics, but what I'm teaching you today is geared partly towards having the page look a certain way, and also for visual pleasure, but also for you know, just for readability. And I think those are both really important. I'm going to show you one last page where the composition is kind of funky before I go on. Now this one is it has to do with planning. So sometimes when you start off, you give yourself plenty of space, but then as you get towards the bottom of the page, you start to squish things in. And what I've noticed is this happens more towards the end of the page, but it also happens when you're getting towards the end of your journal, and maybe you're on a trip and you're running out of pages and you start squishing things in. So those are a couple examples of what I think can go wrong when we're not paying attention to composition. And I'm not saying, once again, I'm not saying that these pages are terrible or anything like that, but I think it's important to understand some of these principles, and that will help all of you. I'm gonna give some shout outs here. I see people commenting. Hi, Kate. Hi, Linda. Hi, Ivea. Hi, Nature Sketches. Hi, Miriam. Thanks for all the well wishes about the fires and everything. I see Nature Sketches. All right, thanks everybody for joining. Now I'm gonna dive into some more stuff here. So first I wanna show you a page where I was trying to be intentional, and I didn't finish this page, but I will show you a page where I started off with intentionality. around composition. And I'm using this really pale, this is something I'll talk about more in a second, but I really like these pale Tombow pens to lay out my plan for how I'm going to compose my page. So you can see that I started off just kind of with blocking in where I'm going to put a title, and I blocked in, this is a potato, showing the growth on a potato, and I did multiple pages. So I wanted to repeat the pages and have them all have a similar appearance. And that's something that's really important. And that's something that Kate talked about when I interviewed her about her avocado journal. She talked about how if you have a lot of consistency and creative constraints and you're comparing something over and over, such as the growth of a potato, it's very important to have that consistency, because if each page looks totally different, it's not a good comparison. So I laid this out. I put in this sort of underdrawing with me. I even planned where the text would go, and I find these pale markers really useful. I'll talk more about that in a second, but here's the idea of how, you know, being intentional with the layout from the beginning can be really helpful. And you'll notice that there's a good use of space. So some of the things that really influence your composition and the readability is that consistent visual vocabulary, hierarchy. So there is a hierarchy here, and that was lacking from one of the other examples I showed you. But the hierarchy tells you what information is most important. And so the very first thing is the title. See how that is so big? Then there's also a visual vocabulary with what is in black ink and what is in gray ink. So all of the drawings are in black ink and all of the writing is in gray ink. So that creates a visual vocabulary and a hierarchy. There's also space. So having space between things is super important. Notice how this is all empty here. This is empty over there. There's a nice margin, consistency around the text down here compared to that one I just showed you where all the Canada geese were squished into the bottom. So space, and then the ideas being organized. So having the ideas being organized, like this whole area here is about a funky spot that I noticed on the side of the potato. Now let me show you that other page in contrast. This would be contrasting here. There is not a good hierarchy of information. So there's not, like, at the top of the page a good title. In fact, the thing that stands out most is this note that I made to myself that this would be a good spot to go tracking in the summer. And then also this easy substrate. So that's all about tracking. That's not really about like where I am. It's not a good hierarchy of information. Here is a question. This question is really emphasized, but then the drawing of what I'm actually drawing is less emphasized than the question word who. So that is not really a good organization of information or a good visual hierarchy. And there's not good space, use of empty space. This is very crowded, and you can see there's this watercolor experiment right here where I'm trying to learn about water. Just goes straight into these rocks here, and that is not leaving space. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit more about how I use that Tombow marker. This is an example, and I'm going to talk a little bit, mostly today I'm talking about how to use composition in the field. And I really think that nature journaling in the field is really the heart of our practice. And there's a lot of cool stuff you can do at home and from photos and doing research and all of that. But nature journaling in the field from life is really the heart of our practice. However, there's things you can do where you start with your sketches in the field, such as this toad. This is the Colorado River toad, the one that has DMT. But then you can leave spaces, and especially if you're using that Tombow marker, or maybe some people are using their non-photo blue pencil, you could leave spaces for later research. So for example, while I was there, I did these sketches of the actual toad, and I left space. You can see the pale marker here. I left space for putting in the name, and I sort of blocked in the letters so that I would have more consistent lettering. But then this research about the molecule, I didn't do that in the field, and I did that afterwards. So I'll show you an example of how you might lay out your page while you're in the field, or you might make a plan that you can fill in later. And this helps you see here, I got this basic sketch of a frog, and then I also started to block in the lettering. This helps me get the lettering more even and not end up squishing it. The worst is when you get to the margin and you have to squish in 5 letters into a small space. And then I'm ready to put in text here. Now, this is a separate problem that I can talk about on another day, but sometimes when you're in the field, you think, oh, I'm gonna get home and I'm gonna add all this more information, and then you actually don't. So that can be a problem. But you can see there how I basically am planning the layout, but there is a big gap here, so there would probably need to be something there. So I'm planning the layout in the field and adding to it when I get home. Now I'm going to show you another page. This is a great contrast, super great contrast, and I think it shows how I've learned a lot about this. And I want to give a shout out to JP because I definitely learned a lot about layout and composition. I'm not even going to get into grid theory right now, JP, because you're the expert on that, but JP definitely helped me think a lot about layout. So here's a perfect example. This is 2016 right here. I'm at the California Academy just squeezing everything in. And sometimes you get lucky with layout when you don't understand it, but that's sort of just luck. But I would say this is pretty busy, you know, like I mentioned all the downsides of it. Now here's at the San Diego Zoo, and this is much more recently. And you can see here that this is also in a similar setting. It's very busy. There's lots of different animals, but there's space. The page is organized much better. There's almost rule of thirds thing going on here, and the visual vocabulary is consistent. So one thing you'll notice is that all of the drawings inside of these boxes are just ink. They're just black and white, whereas the drawings outside of the boxes have color. So there's a consistency that is really good. All right, I'm seeing some funny comments over here. Yes, Ivea, I am safe from the fires right now. We're not on evacuation warning where I'm in Sebastopol yet. There are evacuated areas very close, and it's really smoky, but I do have everything ready to go just in case. Yeah, so this is a page where I think you can see a big difference between these two pages. I mean, which is your eye drawn to more? Which do you think is more readable of these two? Obviously this one, right? Okay, let's keep going. So now one thing, oh, here's another example. I'm gonna start talking a little bit about some of the tools that you need, or some of the elements that are really useful. So there are a lot of different elements that are useful when you are thinking about your composition in your nature journal. I love boxes. I love swatches, arrows, text, titles, shadows, and overlap. So boxes are great. So here's an example, sort of just like how you could use a box and maybe there's like a bird or whatever in here, and that frame really helps organize the image. And you can see it works really well when you are doing a close-up. So here's a close-up of this potato growth, and this box is really helpful for doing it. Now, you don't need to put all your drawings in boxes, but thinking about where there's going to be boxes and where there aren't going to be boxes. So for example, here you can see this would be a layout where I have some type of drawing inside of a box here, framed there. Then I have my text, and then here is maybe a landscape photo without a box. So using both can be really useful. However, it is possible to go overboard with boxes or not use them properly, and the same with arrows. So here's a page where I had good intentions and I'm using some good elements, but the balance I would say is off, and the arrows are kind of going all over the place. So these are multiple times where I tried to use these blowout boxes where you have something here, you circle it, bring an arrow over to another area, and you do a more close-up of it. However, I think this page got a little bit out of hand, or maybe I'm just trying to do that too many times, and I lost a little bit with readability. Boxes are also super, super useful for landscape ethos, of course. And actually, I think this is one of the most important uses of boxes, is for doing landscape ethos. And this frame forces you to fit it into that small area and instead of trying to fill that whole page, which can be a disaster. And then that creates, once it's inside of that frame, that whole drawing is a visual element in itself. So in addition to having the different visual elements inside of that landscape ethos, that is like a chunk, and you can think about how that fits into your pages. So let me show you an example of one that's not framed. Let's see, where is my other? I have so many nature journals all piled up here that might, oh well, I might not be able to find that one right now. Anyways, with landscape ethos, the boxes are definitely helpful. And then once you have them in boxes, you have to start thinking about how you organize those on the page. So let's see if I have an example of that. Okay, well, I'm going to check the chat real quick. How are people doing? Someone's asking, hi, Melly, from, where's Melly coming in from? I saw Bolivia. Hi, Melly, welcome. And JP is a friend and fellow nature journaler. Thanks, Ivea, for answering that question. Feel free to post any other questions in the chat box. I really appreciate your engagement, and hopefully this video will help you some with composition. It's something I'm really passionate about. Now here's another example of fitting your pages, your landscape ethos onto a page. Once they're in these boxes, they become visual elements that you can move around, and then you have to think about their composition. So you can see here, I did a sort of alternating thing where I have one tall, skinny one, I have two long, wide ones, and then here I switch it up where the tall one's on this side. So if I had done it the opposite way and just had two tall ones straight in a row, that would be too much symmetry. So there's definitely a good rule in visual design and in layout and composition where you don't want too much symmetry and you don't want too many lines lining up with each other. So you can see this white space right here lines up and sends your eye straight into the middle of this one. This white space over here sends your eye straight into middle of that one. And then down here it reverses. If this straight middle white space lined up with this other one, it would just shoot your eye off the bottom of the page. So that's one good thing to be aware of. And I'm going to show you how it's really, you can see there's a beauty in the consistency of the size of these landscapes, because I use a frame whenever I paint them. I cut this out of paper and I use this. So when I'm drawing the landscape, I look at it through here and get it lined up with my eye. And then I figure out like how I want to crop it. And then I trace this onto the page. And just that consistency is super useful. I'll show you an example. Before I was doing that, my landscapes were all different sizes. Like on this page, they're all of these are different sizes. I mean, those two are similar, but they're all different sizes, and it just takes away from the aesthetic and the layout. So that's what I would call a creative constraint, and that consistent visual vocabulary is super important. So it looks a lot better when you have the consistent sizes to your landscapes. So a lot of times people who are more artistic, who are nature journaling, think like, oh, well, being artistic is about like being free. But a lot of the greatest artists of all time have remarked on how important it is to have constraints, and that by limiting yourself, that's where your creativity can really come out, and things often look better when you have some consistency like that. So now I'm going to show another page. I thought I showed all the ones that didn't look great, but I'm going to show you another one where I was sort of experimenting and hadn't come up with a proper hierarchy or visual vocabulary that's consistent. So you can see here from a distance that there's multiple colors of text and multiple colors of outline. So the main problem that I found here was that this brown is almost the same value, so almost as dark as the drawing of this spider here. And these are bird tracks there. And then there's gray. The gray pen is a lighter value. So what would have actually been better is if I could, and then I have black pen up here. So I have text in multiple colors, and that becomes a little bit confusing. There's also the layout's not the greatest. Like there's a little bit of, it's a little bit imbalanced towards the top. So it's good to start thinking about these things, and when you look back at your work, you can recognize what's happening. Now here's sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. I started paying a lot more attention to planning and creating a consistency. I now really like to use the gray pen for writing. So all of the text is in gray pen, and the drawings are with the black ink. And that's with that pen that I really like, that I've reviewed in some of my YouTube videos. And you can see I still create a hierarchy with the words because I put the title into bubble letters and make it bigger. I didn't pre-plan that one, so you can see it's not the greatest lettering. Then here, the metadata is inside of a box. There's also, notice there's frames, there's pale frames around the landscape ethos. That's also done, I think that's a gray Tombow pen. And then here you can see this landscape ethos is not framed. So sometimes going back and forth between framed and not framed can be useful. I planned out a box here for the title of this type of seaweed. This is a seaweed here. And then I have a zoomed in segment of the seaweed there. So you can see that even this text box down here, I planned out how it would fit, and I think the page has more of an overall consistency and a nice, pleasing composition to it. Okay, let's see what's next. Elements. I'm going to talk about some of these elements now. Boxes. Let me show you some more boxes. I really like using boxes to organize the page. Here's an example that was done in the field, and I did not have extra time to really think about things. This was when I was with the Hadzabe hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, and I was running around following them as they were hunting, and in this case they were getting honey out of a baobab tree. But you can see how boxes and arrows really helped tell the story here. So right here I have sort of a bigger drawing that's not framed. And then all around it, there are things in frame. So here, there's two more segments showing the process used. They're carving these stakes that they then use to pound into the tree. And they pound these into the tree as they climb up to get to where the honey is. This is a close-up of where the bees come out, showing this wax tube. This is also not in a frame. So you can see there's not in a frame drawing, not in a frame drawing, and then there's frame, this text is in a frame, and see honey is hierarchically important because it's talking about like the main idea of this narrative, what they're going after, and this arrow even has the color sort of honey and is pointing to what's happening there. So composition is really important when it comes to narrative and telling a story. So I highly recommend, looking at graphic novels, looking at comics, and how do they use composition to tell stories. Comic book pages are a great place to take inspiration about composition. Another place, some of them are bad, but look at textbooks. Some science textbooks or even manuals, like manuals for your car, might have interesting aspects of composition to give information. Now here's an example of boxes being used with overlap. You can see here I've got text describing what's happening because sometimes text is faster. I have a drawing here showing how they make this cordage from the bark of a tree, and then they use that bark to tie the axe handle onto this long shaft right here. So this overlap and that arrow help you show that this goes into what's happening here, and then this shows how this type of axe gets transformed into that tool there. So using arrows is really useful. And one thing I was just reading about recently in a book that Akshay and Gargi lent to me. What was that book called? I think it was called Drawing Ideas, and it said for a consistent visual vocabulary to have two different types of arrows. So it said to have one type of arrow that shows like a blowout box or like a zooming in on something, and another type of arrow that shows movement in a process. So I've been trying to do that consistently because I used to use both of these arrows in the same way, or I would use them interchangeably. And what I'm trying to do now is use this type of arrow to show like, oh, this is something that's happening in this specific place. And then this type of arrow to show process. So you could see here, this example is process. This is part of a process and goes there, or this is part of a movement. This type of axe is turned into that type of axe. Whereas the other arrow, this one, using this consistently to show like, say for example, you say like blue coloring here. Maybe when you're drawing a bird, you don't have colors, and you just make this arrow, and then over here you have like the bird or whatever, and then this is the description of that particular spot. So anyways, coming up with some visual vocabulary, I highly recommend stealing ideas from the sketchnoting community. Kate Rudder does sketchnoting, and there's a lot of other nature journalers who do, and you can find books about sketchnoting that will really help understanding and how to create a consistent visual vocabulary. Here's another example of a 2-page spread. This is also still with the Hadzabe. I got a little bit lucky with composition because I was like running around with them, but this is showing narrative and continuing a story across multiple pages. You can see the axe is still there, and this is like a close-up of the axe, obviously not to scale, over the guy here and the tree where they're going to go hunt for the honey. And then here is the process again of going for the honey, and you can see the wooden stake, and here is a box that goes across the whole thing, and there's overlap too. So some elements in the box are coming out of the frame. Ideally, you do that in the front of the box and not in the back of the box so much. Okay. I need to drink some water. How's everyone doing? Let me know if you have any specific questions that you would like me to answer around composition or anything that you've been working on. JP is asking a question about arrows. I think she's asking that to Kate about that. She's also recommending that book, Drawing Ideas. Very cool book. It's called Drawing Ideas. Drawing Ideas. Check the comments. If you're on Facebook, you can check on there. Some of these people are watching on YouTube. I will post just the name of that book. I can't remember the author right now, but definitely look that up if you can. Okay, next. Let's keep going here. I don't know why this book is here. All right, color swatches. I didn't really talk about that too much, but color swatches can be a cool element, a cool visual element that can add, it's relaxing to make them when you're in the field, but they can add a nice, this isn't the best layout on this page, but check this out. See how you can just use these. I used to do this a lot more and haven't been doing it lately. While you're doing your color testing and trying to match colors to your environment, you can just create these swatches and use them as sort of like a decorative element, and it can add a really nice effect. You can also do them across the page, kind of separating different elements, and creates a border. Borders and callouts. Yeah, exactly. So I think these color swatches can provide a nice, really subtle border, and it's also something that is just a practical. It's kind of killing two birds with one stone, or feeding two birds with one scone. You can be testing your color and getting a border at the same time. it looks like JP was the one that introduced Akshay and Gargi to that book. I didn't realize that, so thanks JP for pointing that out. We have to remember our lineage of how we learn these things. So I'm going to talk more about some boxes and borders here, and this will segue nice into some other elements of composition. I haven't been doing this that much lately, but it can be really fun to just do these boxes where you have a solid patch of watercolor. Maybe you have extra ink or extra watercolor on your brush and you just need to get rid of it. But creating this box is a way to add space and separate things out. And part of the reason why I ended up using it here was I had drawn all of these pitcher plants, but I didn't want to draw what they were growing in. I wanted to just kind of have more of a diagrammatic approach to them. So when I did that, I decided, okay, I'm just going to make this box, and the box goes underneath this other picture, which is more close up, and that makes that one stand out a little bit more. So that's an example, and here it's kind of in the middle of the page, but ideally you would use thirds to separate things out, and that's something I haven't talked about yet, and I'm not going to get super in depth into composition stuff, but the rule of thirds is basically dividing things into elements of 3 instead of like into half. So here's an example of kind of what you don't want to do. So put your main subject right in the middle, and it's sort of like a big bullseye. Instead, what can be better is, and there's a little bit of it here, but to divide things approximately into thirds on your page. So this would be a visual element, this is another one, and this is another one. And each one is almost the same and divides the page into thirds. And that ends up coming out a lot better. It's not really clear why, but it's just a known design thing. It's something about how people see. So here's an example. It doesn't mean that you have to have 3 evenly separated sections. You could have one could be 1/3, and then one could be 2/3. And I think I was trying to do that intentionally here. These are more carnivorous plants, and you can see this bottom one has a frame around it and is approximately 2/3 of the page, and then this upper one is unframed and is 1/3 of the page. So that is one way that you can divide your page up. Here's an example where it doesn't quite meet that. Like this is a little bit less than 1/3, and this is inside of a box, and this one is not. All right. Another thing you can do is just, sometimes this works, a lot of times it doesn't, is just fill the page. Sometimes just by evenly spacing things out and doing a bunch of like gesture sketches or trying to understand the shape of a leaf, you can create a pretty nice aesthetic just by filling the entire page. Okay, it's hard to keep these all organized. Here's another page with borders and a good use of balance and space. These are some landscape-itos and some more close-ups of these palm trees intermingled with text. And this goes back to the thing I was saying about empty space. So you can see there's this empty space. The light. There's this empty space here around the text. And instead of that just going all the way out to the side, it crashes into this drawing here. And up here, the empty space crashes into it there. This empty space in between these two lines up with the text. And then down here, this one is overlapping that one. So I think that actually creates a much more pleasing aesthetic. And then I have my title way down here because I didn't really think of it right away. So this is one of the downsides of trying to do composition in the field is, and this is something that Akshay and Gargi have talked about, is if you think you know what the main idea is when you start nature journaling and you write the title up here at the top, then as you start to look at things and ask questions, you realize that's actually not the main idea or the most interesting thing, but you already had the title there. So sometimes just leaving a space for the title and thinking about where it's going to fit into the composition, and then going on with your drawing. And then later on, maybe you'll figure out, you know, why no mistletoe grow in palm trees. That was the main idea. All right, let's see what else I got here. I have some more about the elements of thirds. Here is a page where I used more borders, and this is still Tombow pins. I like them. They are water soluble, but I kind of like that. It comes out subtle. Everybody's got to find their own thing though. So Tombow pins might work for some of you. Here I put borders around this landscapeito, and then I was going to do a close-up of roots, which I didn't end up doing. But you can see here this page is divided into basically into thirds. I think that it's pretty simple and easy. All of the text is in gray pen, and all of the drawing is mostly watercolor and ink, including this drawing up here. My basic metadata is also in ink. Let's see, I am seeing a lot of comments here. Yes, just so people know, the comments in YouTube and Facebook will be separate. There are some people watching on YouTube. Kate is saying that bullseyes can be tricky. Circles can be tricky too. I have seen some people do nice stuff with circles. I haven't experimented with it that much, but you know, one example would be like, so say for example on this page, you could have, instead of these being rectangular, you could have like a circle border, and maybe doing something where you have it alternate like this, and you could have like zoomed in on one aspect of the bird or the plant that you're looking at. Let's see. JP's asking a really important question about having recipes, pre-made layouts before going into the field. I usually don't. I've done that a couple times. So like for example, if I laid this out on my page, or even like this one, or just like a plan, it's something that I would like to work with more. And I know JP does that a lot and has like a thing in the back of her journal where she has those. That's a great idea. I haven't done it very much. I kind of doing it like on the fly, but I think that's a really good idea. And that's something especially would make it easier when you're first getting started. Yeah, I think it is. Eve is asking if it's a rhythm you eventually find. I think with time, you do eventually get to a point where you kind of just get into a flow. Hi, Karen. I see Karen is here on YouTube, watching on YouTube. Thanks for joining. And if any of you join in the middle, you can always go back and watch the recorded video afterwards. Kate's mentioning some vocabulary from sketchnoting, which is really useful, raw capture, and post noting, which is the review and synthesis after the capture. That's really cool. Thanks, Kate, for joining that. Someone on Facebook is saying that composition can help track something over time. For example, put weather in the same spot. That is super useful. So for example, like if your metadata is always in the top left corner and you always show the weather in the same way, then you could just flip through your journals and you could easily find like your journal from last year at the same time of year and be like, oh, it's the same. But instead, look, I look at mine, and if it's, you know, well, this is still kind of similar, but if there's some consistency there in your layout, it will help you check things over time. That is a very good point. Thanks for pointing that out. Kate is on Facebook, is sharing a interesting a link that I will try to copy for people who are watching on YouTube. Hi, Mariana is joining on YouTube. I'm going to keep going with some of the last few pages. For those of you who are joining in now, you can definitely watch this video, the recorded version of this video afterwards. Here's another example, sort of similar to the last one, where I'm using the rule of thirds, but in this case, it's 1/3 up here and 2/3 down here. I do have, this is a very pale composition, so not always recommendable. And here you can see I've used I think I used a pencil to draw the border around the landscape, but I kept it sort of faint, especially towards the top. And then I just, while I'm doing this, one technique that I use, and I think I made a video about this, is painting a landscape. And while you're sitting there painting the landscape, paying attention to the birds. And along the side column here, I pay attention to birds or a beetle or what's going on with the ripples, all of these different things. These notes are going along here. So even though a lot of us who are think of ourselves as creative people or as artists, a lot of times we're like, constraints sounds like a bad word. But if you can come up with a couple things like this that you just repeat, or the way that JP is talking about it, like if in the back of your book, or at the beginning of a new journal, you say, I'm going to use these 5 compositions, and you just lay out 5, or you have like one that you use when you nature journal at a certain location or whatever, and you're just consistent about that. It sounds really boring right now when I explain it that way, but it's super powerful. And if you can be consistent and keep using the same thing, one benefit is that when you're out there in the field, you're not going to be thinking, oh, what layout should I use now? You're going to know what layout you should use, and you can be focusing on the animals and the plants and whatever's around you. Then the second huge benefit is that comparison thing. If you look through your book and you have a bunch of compositions that are just like this, you do the metadata, the weather is done in the same way, and the titles of the location is done in the same way. You flip through that book and it's going to really help with the readability. And so those are the important things that make composition important are the aesthetics. It can make it visually more pleasing, and the readability. So those are super useful. Let's see. I think I had one other thing that I wanted to share. Let's see here. Oh yeah, let me share. I have an example of a landscape that has no frame around it. And sometimes it's fun to do a whole page landscape, but I really think in a lot of ways this is not anywhere near as powerful as another one that's smaller in a frame, such as this, which is in a frame, or that one that I was just showing you is a lot better too. So this. So basically, I think this is a place where nature journalers can really excel, and there's a lot of cool other fields that we can look at. So I really recommend looking at comic books, graphic novels, textbooks like scientific books can be really good. Sketchnoting is a really useful field. And by taking from all of those fields, we can really excel a lot in our nature journaling and make our pages. I feel that, a nature journal page that uses composition well and balances words and images and numbers creates something that's so much more beautiful. It's like those old sketchbooks of Leonardo da Vinci's where he has his notes and he has little diagrams. To me, those are more beautiful than the Mona Lisa. And so I think that there's something just aesthetically really amazing, and also the way that it can communicate information is so much more powerful. So I hope these tips and tricks helped, and there's so much more to learn, but I just want to share some of the stuff that I've been working with, and hopefully you can go out into the field and experiment more. So hopefully today you'll get out and do some nature journaling, or at least do a little practice at home. Thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Ivea. Thanks, Mariana. Thanks for the people whose names I can't read on Facebook. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, JP. Thanks to everybody else, Nature Sketches, and Linda, and everybody. All right, have a good one. Bye. Time for me to open up a beer. Bye.